part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Now the 2-2 offering. A swing and a drive! Deep left! Way back! Gone! Albert Bell, the first man in baseball history with 50 home runs, 50 doubles, and what a joyous jogger on the bases.
Winds it up, delivers. Thome drills one high and deep to center. Away, way back. Gone deep into the picnic plaza, and that might have even got out of the ballpark. Jim Thome has just left Jacobs Field.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sable Brothers on the Baseline Podcast, right here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. We are your hosts, John Sable.
And I'm Scott Sable.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can do so on Twitter. You can follow the pod at Sable Brothers. You can follow yours truly at John_Sable.
And you can follow me at Scott Sable FOX8 and on Instagram and every other place too, I'm sure.
And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe, give us a rating. That way you get the latest updates and latest episodes that drop to your smartphone, tablet, or computer. By subscribing, you'll get all that notifications there for you. So, Scott, it is cold out here in Northeast Ohio, but man, you and I know this. It is never too early to talk baseball, which is why we have the perfect guest today.
That's right, John. Our listeners know our guest from the 4 decades behind the radio mic at the corner of Carnegie and Ontario. He's been the voice of the Cleveland Indians, now Guardians, since way back in the late 1990s and has been with the organization since 1990. He's also the former TV voice of Ohio State men's basketball for ESPN Plus and the Big Ten Network. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest on Sable Brothers and the Baseline Podcast, the legendary play-by-play broadcaster, Tom Hamilton.
Hi, guys. How are you?
Tom, great to hear you. Great to see you. Thanks for coming on. I know you're out in Arizona getting geared up for spring training. And for those that don't know, real quick, before we kind of get into this, Scott and I work with your son, Brad. If our listeners are watching Fox 8 here in the Cleveland area, he is a reporter here, and we've been keeping a good eye on him. Happy to report he's doing a great job, and he is behaving himself.
Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate the kind words and appreciate how good you've been to Brad, because believe me, he's told me how much advice you guys have given him and guidance. And, we're very grateful for that. And we're lucky to have him back in town and working for Fox 8 as well.
You know, it's funny. I ran into him when he was coming into the building real quick. I didn't realize how tall he was. I mean, wow, wait a minute. I'm about 5'11". I'm not super tall. It's like, wow, I didn't say that to him because he walked by me. I'm like, wow, he's tall.
I don't know where he got it from, but he's Nick was about 6'1", 6'2", and Brad's about 6'4", and so it helped them athletically. And now when they're flying is now when they kind of regret being that size.
Well, Tom, over the years, people know you as a part of Northeastern Ohio for many decades, over a generation and a half with baseball. But where did you grow up? People who might not know your background.
I grew up on a dairy farm outside of Waterloo, Wisconsin, which isn't going to help anybody listening to this. But that's about Waterloo. When I was growing up, was a town of about 1,500 and kind of a typical small Wisconsin farm community. I mean, back in those days, that was, one of the prime ways people made their living was dairy farms in Wisconsin. And so we were about half hour east of Madison, about an hour west of Milwaukee. And then when I was in 7th grade, we moved into the metropolis of Waterloo, which still doesn't have a traffic light, and but does have 6 taverns. So that's kind of Wisconsin in a nutshell.
Oh, no traffic lights still to this day? That's crazy.
Has a stop sign, and that's optional, so.
That's what we call progress. They're getting there.
Yeah.
Tom, when did you have the itch to become a broadcaster, and eventually explain how that itch became your path to Northeast Ohio and to the Cleveland Indians?
I kind of go back to my days on the farm. I mean, it is a great way for people, obviously, to make a living. When you're a little kid on a farm, you don't necessarily think that because all of your friends are in town playing ball or doing things that you thought were much more exciting. And you're on a farm, your closest neighbor might be a mile away. And so I think literally listening to a transistor radio to Earl Gillespie and the old Milwaukee Braves back in the mid 60s before they moved to Atlanta. And it just seemed like, such a magical place that he was at each and every night at a ballpark, from these incredible cities he was traveling to. And, all of us want to be a professional player. I think if any of us played sports, but most of us learn at an early age that that's not realistic. And so for me, if I wasn't good enough to be a pro athlete, this seemed like the next best thing. And so you go to college and then, you kind of work your way up. I was in Shell Lake, Wisconsin, Watertown, Wisconsin, Appleton, Milwaukee, then Columbus, Ohio. And there's where I got some AAA experience. And that was, for me, the key to getting not only the job in Cleveland, but even getting an opportunity to apply for a job being in Columbus doing AAA. So that kind of a short path for how it took me a long time, but you know what? I enjoyed every step along the way. And I worked with great people along the way. I loved doing high school football and basketball and baseball and really would have been happy to do major college football and basketball for the rest of my life. But baseball was always the ultimate and was, fortunate enough then to land the Cleveland job.
Of course, being on the road with the baseball schedule, it's a grueling schedule. I mean, you have 162 games at the major league level. The minor league schedule is slightly, under that. How do you balance being on the road so much and having a family over the years?
Well, it starts with a great wife. I mean, there's no way that any of us in the baseball world make it unless you have a great partner. And that's true with the players as it is with coaches, the manager, broadcasters. I mean, you're gone more than you're at home. Nothing ever happens bad when you're at home. It's always when you're on the road. That's when somebody falls out of a tree and, you get a call from the ER room, somebody's arm is being put in a cast. So that falls on your wife. And, I have a great wife in Wendy. We have 4 terrific children, but it presented some challenges, to say the least, with that schedule. You miss out on some things, if you have regrets when you look back, those years in Little League, those years growing up, you missed a number of things. But, I think the way we always tried to look at it, you got some things other kids didn't have. You went to spring training. You had teachers that were okay with you missing 2 weeks of school and doing your assignments, in those days in Winter Haven, Florida. And so, it's give and take, but it starts with a great wife.
Were there any broadcasters, you touched on this earlier, any broadcasters that you idolized growing up? I mean, of course, in Chicago, you have Harry Carey. Back then, wasn't it Jack Buck in St. Louis?
Yeah.
And I know, St. Louis is a long way away, but any of those Midwest broadcasters or any others?
You know what? I think, and I get that question a lot, Scott, and it's always a great question. And for me, the simple answer is I think all of us as broadcasters have been influenced by the people we heard when we grew up. And so, when I tell people some of the guys I listen to, they'll kind of look at you like, huh? Well, maybe they weren't national, so you didn't know them. Now, Earl Gillespie did Green Bay Packer football, Wisconsin Badger football, and the Milwaukee Braves, and could have easily gone to Atlanta, but did not want to and wanted to stay in Wisconsin. So he was the guy that, for me, first, was the guy that I heard that made me think, what a way to make a living. And then I was fortunate enough to do Badger football with him for a year on the radio, which was like winning the lottery. I mean, the guy that you thought was, next to your parents, maybe the most impressive figure in your life, you ended up getting to work with him. And that was a great experience for me. But we had really good play-by-play people when I grew up. Gary Bender was in Madison at that time, and Gary was doing, all of the sports in addition to anchoring the sports on the Channel 27 out of Madison. Then Gary went on to do the Badgers and Packers, and eventually became the voice of CBS Sports. He did the great Final Four and the New Mexico, down in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when North Carolina State had that improbable win over Houston, and that was Gary Bender at the mic with Billy Packer. Then when the Brewers came into existence, Merle Harmon and Bob Uecker were doing the games.
Mhm.
And Merle Harmon was the New York Jets play-by-play guy when Joe Namath won the Super Bowl. And anyone that's ever heard Merle Harmon's work, he also did work for NBC. This was one of the top people in the industry. So in a state like Wisconsin, to have guys like that went to the network but also did local, to me was really fortunate. And then you'd listen to other guys, you mentioned them. Back in those days when the Braves left, that was so devastating when they left Milwaukee, that you'd listen to the Cub games, and that was Vince Lloyd and Lou Boudreau, So there were a lot of names, you'd spin that dial and you'd hear Herb Carneal on WCCO out of Minneapolis, and all the great names, Ernie with the Tigers, and Jack Buck, as you mentioned. And of course, Jack Buck, got to meet him later on. He's a Lakewood native. So it's amazing at times what a small world all of us are in.
You mentioned some of those Hall of Fame broadcasters, Jack Buck, and there's like maybe Vin Scully and Ernie Harwell and Harry Callis. In your time with the Indians in the 90s, when Harwell and Callis, and even Scully, maybe early 2000s, when the Indians would play the Dodgers on the road, when you came across those, I'll use those three legends for an example. Did you ever get starstruck, or were you ever just like, oh my gosh, these guys they're here. Yeah. They're right in front of me. They're the real deal. They're right in here.
For me, John, that was more intimidating meeting them than it was any player. Because those are the guys that maybe you had something in common with work-wise, but you sure as heck didn't belong on their level for the kind of broadcasters they were. But yeah, and I think that was the best part. When I think back to 90, my first year, you're going to all these cities, farm boys from Wisconsin aren't usually spending a lot of time in Manhattan. So unless it's Manhattan, Kansas. So, going to those cities, going to those parks, that first year, nothing will ever top that. But then on top of that, meeting those guys, and for the most part, never being disappointed after you met them, because they ended up, as you found out later, they were better people than they were broadcasters. There will never be anybody as good as Vin Scully, ever, in any sport. And he was an even better person. And you would never know his stature when you went and introduced yourself to him. And Ernie was like that. I can't think of a bad encounter that I had with almost every one of those broadcasters, which to me was remarkable because they didn't look at themselves as iconic. But to your point, yeah, I was more nervous walking into their booth, introducing myself to them, than I was going in a clubhouse or talking to a player or a manager.
And you first worked with Herb Score, of course, back in 1990. There's another one right there. He was with the organization from when he pitched back in the 50s, and you worked with him. Did he offer you any advice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, Scott, outside of my dad, the best advice I've ever been given in my life came from Herb. And, talk about being scared to get that job. And I didn't know Herb, but you knew what an icon he was in Cleveland. You knew about his baseball career and what he had a chance to be before he was struck by that line drive. Tony Kubek, who's another Wisconsin native, former Yankees shortstop, and again is in the Baseball Broadcasters Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. probably the very first player that got to the level broadcasting wise that Tony Kubek did. And, Tony said for him when he was playing back in the late 50s, and, Herb was harder to hit than Sandy Koufax for him. So you hear those kind of stories, and you're like, oh my. And Herb could be very intimidating, but he was tremendous to myself. His wife, Nancy, was great to both Wendy and I, and we became good friends. And, just, again, I was lucky. This business is so much about timing. For me to be working with Herb when we were bad, when we were in the old stadium, and then to still be with him moving into Jacobs Field and then having that Renaissance era of baseball, you were accepted by the audience because Herb accepted you. So that made my transition to the big leagues so much easier, for which I'm always grateful for, because, Herb was Herb's scorer. He didn't need me. But he always treated me as an equal, gave me great advice on, look, we're a bad team. We're going to be a bad team. That can't impact your broadcast. The record means nothing when the game starts. How for a lot of people, this is the highlight of their day. They're shut-ins or maybe don't have much to look forward to. And again, it's a different time back in the 90s. I mean, maybe 50 games were televised, maybe 70,
right.
Not like it is today. So radio was even more vital.
I remember as a kid in the 90s, Tom, listening to those games with you and Herb scoring the radio. And I remember my dad telling, hey, this guy was supposed to be, the next big thing. And he would educate, us on Herb's score and on the line drive. And, baseball was our sport as kids growing up. My dad, from the Cleveland area, grew up in Brook Park. And then his dad, our grandfather, was a old vendor at Municipal Stadium. So, a lot of our baseball history was taught from our dad those years, and then eventually goes on. And Scott and I both, and I learned a lot from my brother too. But Herb Score was one, I think, of my early childhood. That was, when I think of broadcasters, I think of you and Herb and Joe Tate were the three that were like shaped my life as a kid.
Well, thank you. I mean, and you got to remember too with Herb, I think people, one, they loved him because of the kind of pitcher he was, how his career tragically was altered, but yet you never heard talk about woulda, coulda, shoulda, or what might have I become. Herb was always incredibly, I don't know if gifted is the right word, to put whatever happened in the past stay in the past and not look back and not dwell on it. And that was part of his journey. But we don't look back. You always look out the windshield, not the rear view mirror. And I mean, I don't know how he did it. The amount of times, guys, people would come up to Herb when we'd be on the road or spring training, and Herb, I was sound asleep in bed that night. You got hit by that line drive, but my mom came and woke me up. And you'd be like, oh my Lord, stop and think what you're saying. But he handled it with such grace, as he did how it impacted his career. He'll always tell you, nah, my elbow blew out. Well, what he won't tell you is because he changed his delivery and his mechanics, because when he would release the ball, his head always was down. And when his head came up, it's too late. And that's how he got hit. And, but yeah, both he and Nancy just had, and they had 4 children. One was a Downs child, a daughter. And, how they integrated her in the family. And she was every bit as important, probably more so than the other children. Again, you never heard that on the outside, but they were such examples of how to live your life.
Another broadcaster and a good friend and another notable broadcaster in the Cleveland area, your buddy Mike Hegan. I know you two were very close, and he had that distinctive voice when he did it on the radio with you or on television. What was it like working with him?
I think he's as good as anybody that's ever done it. I think he should be in the Ford Frick wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. When I talk about Tony Kubek, I put Mike in the same sentence. No player has ever been as good at what they did broadcasting as Mike and Tony, because they could do radio, they could do television, they could do color, but they could also do play-by-play. And very few can do that. And his sense of humor was second to none. His quickness, his insight. And Mike worked at the job when he was with the Milwaukee Brewers. In the off seasons, he was working at WTMJ radio, learning how to write copy, learning how to put stories. He was training for the next phase of his life in the off season when he was a player. And that showed. And I don't think Mike has ever been given enough, recognition. I'll never work with anybody as talented as that again, because I think he's as talented as any person that's ever been in this business.
On that note, Tom, I got to play something for you. You mentioned Mike Hegan and the talent and the fun and the stories that he would give you guys. I found this clip online. I wanted to play it for you because I vaguely remember this in the 90s, and maybe this will spark a memory for you and maybe the year. But I want to play a clip of, I think it was a West Coast game, and you and Mike were just chatting about ice cream. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Swings and things.
Yes. So let me play it because Scott has not heard this. So here you go.
I go to Swings and Things just for the ice cream. Kids love it. To go there and play, I go to eat the ice cream. He gave me a carton of it one time and never got home. I ate it driving. 2-1 pitch, throw to first and Lofton back. I kept thinking, you can get picked up, obviously, for drinking and driving. Can I get up for eating ice cream and driving? Depends on the look on your face. Is that Rocky Road you've been eating?
Lofton just stole second, but who cares? Oh, man. We're teetering on the edge here. Oh.
It's a good thing it's 1 o'clock in the morning in Cleveland, huh?
Lofton with his second steal tonight. 2-2 pitch, swung on line to center, wouldn't you know it? A base hit. Lofton around third. He'll score. 4-1. Oh boy, we apologize, but we've been on the road a long time. 4-1 Indians.
Tom, did I catch a snort in that at the end?
Oh my God, I'm sure you did. There were some things said that weren't said, and because we were like, we don't want to get fired.
Right.
And you're looking at him to help you out, and he's in the corner not looking at you, doubled over, and and that was Mike. You never planned anything. It was just spontaneous, and he had such a great sense of humor, and that happened to us on several occasions, and it was just as good a person as you could ever meet. And he just, and he was a really good player. He's arguably, and you could debate it, the greatest athlete to ever come out of St. Ignatius. When you think of the great athletes that have come out of there, Mike was recruited by Wisconsin, Notre Dame, and other schools, and went to Holy Cross instead on a football scholarship when Holy Cross was a power back in the late 50s. And, and the only reason he didn't play more than 1 year is his dad told him, look, there's this thing called the Major League Draft that could be coming up. And back in those days, you were a free agent. So he was negotiating with 12 other teams besides the Yankees. And that's why I left college, signed with the Yankees, and, played 12 years in the big leagues. But, people tell you he's as good a football player, basketball player, baseball player Ignatius ever had. And, think of that think how that has stood through the test of time, from when Mike played in the late 50s, and the kids at Ignatius has turned out athletically. So, and again, Mike was another one of those guys that he didn't want to talk about his career unless you brought it up with him, and then he was happy to, but it was never about him. And you miss him every day.
Mm-hmm. Passed away way too early.
He sure did. Yeah.
So about broadcasting, and you mentioned this in a situation like this because it happens sometimes on our morning show where something happens and it's funny, and if it's a private conversation, that you can cross the line if you're amongst friends. But on the air, you got to teeter that line, and it's almost like what's not said is funnier than what's actually said because the listener knows exactly what's going on.
Exactly.
And hearing that, it's like you said, what's not said is funnier than what you guys actually said. How much preparation do you do prior to a broadcast? And do you have a routine in familiarizing yourself with players and teams, especially with all these players now being so much younger?
Yeah. In fact, I'm already doing it in Arizona, excuse me, as we speak for the upcoming season. But yeah, I would say every day you're on the computer, which has made it a lot easier. Although sometimes it ends up being more work because you have more tools available or more research components you can go to. But I would say 3 to 4 hours minimum every morning. And then you get to the ballpark, excuse me, and that might not only be computer. You might be making phone calls to people in the game, be it general managers or coaches or whatnot. And then, I try to get to the ballpark. Oh gosh, if we have a 7:00 game, I'm there no later than 2:30. And you get a chance then to be around the players and coaches. Further away you are from the first pitch, the more open guys are. And, they haven't really kicked into their game face mode yet. But you just, I think if you get to that point where you just want to show up at the ballpark and do the game, you've probably crossed the line as far as being in the business too long. I like being at the ballpark, especially, it's different when you're at home, but on the road, you want to be cooped up in a hotel room. I'd much rather be talking baseball with people at 2:00 at Target Field than I would be sitting in our beautiful Four Seasons hotel.
And we will have more from Tom Hamilton right after this.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Hey, I'm Jason.
And I'm Gary, and we love ball cards.
And if you love ball cards too, good news. You just found your new favorite podcast. From breaks to grading.
And from collecting to flipping, join us on the Ball Card Show.
The sports podcast for the sports collector.
The R&R podcast going to be rocking and rolling with you because football season is underway. College, Ohio State, the Power Fives, the MAC, the Browns. Michael Regai, are you ready to rock and roll with some football?
Kenny, I've been ready. This is our time of year. This is what R&R is all about. We're going to be with you every week. Kenny just said it, Browns, NFL, Ohio State centric. So you got to stay with us all fall and winter long here on R&R.
That's right. The Regai and Rhoda podcast coming to you here on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe now and don't miss a show.
How long did it take you from, we'll go back to 1990. How long did it take you for, what's the word to use, for a lot of the executives, a lot of the coaches to earn your trust? Like you mentioned, you can talk to players and coaches. I'm sure the first couple of years, they didn't know who you were. And then over time, they knew. How long before you went, all right, I can go down to this guy and have a conversation?
Yeah, it's different with every guy, Scott, too, because there are some guys that just aren't that open. I mean, when I was starting initially, I was lucky in that John McNamara was very good to me, but Grover was on that staff and then became our manager. So you could always go to Grover because he you got that trust factor with him in a hurry. We also had a great front office led by Hank Peters, Danny O'Dowd, and John Hart. And they were tremendous. And they would let you in on things, and know that you weren't going to betray their trust. Every front office is different. So that's just kind of everybody you deal with is different. Some people are more open than others, more trusting than others. And, there are certain people in the game, certain executives on certain teams that'll sometimes tell me more than I want to know because you're like, oh, I wish I didn't know that. Because I don't want to spill the beans. And then there are others who everything's a CIA operative. And, you'll ask them a question, you'll get, if we score more runs than they do, we should win. And be like, okay, just can't get that 5 minutes back. So it's different with every team. But again, the longer you're in the league, like you say, at least people don't say most of the time anyway, what do you do? So, but again, it's dependent upon the individual, and some players are better than others. I mean, man, I can remember like George Brett and Kirby Puckett and Cecil Fielder, guys like this from other teams that you could go and talk to ad nauseum with. And Jamie Moyer, there's certain players that like that. There are other players that want no part of it.
It's funny, Tom, when you just mentioned you waste 5 minutes talking to a guy. You got to get more runs than the other team. That reminds me of when I was an intern in 2007 at Fox 8, when I first met you, and you used to do the live interviews for Fox 8 and the 10 o'clock news after the game in the press box. I remember as an intern going to the locker room and not really knowing what to do, but interview with certain Indians players or visiting players. And, a lot of it could have been picking up on an intern with inexperience with maybe a bad question. I would get that maybe a couple times. I won't say who they were, but yeah, I just kind of like, really, you couldn't just give a little bit more. But some guys are just wired that way, though.
Right. And I can remember when I was in Milwaukee working my way up, and at that time was doing Badger football, but my main job was anchoring sports in the morning, getting sound for WISN Channel 12 TV, but more so getting sound for myself for the morning. And, some of the questions I asked a manager on a losing night, they blew up at, and then you'd leave there going, well, that was, what a jerk. And then the more you thought about it, you're like, what a stupid question. So, you live and learn too. Yeah. And some of those were harsh learning experiences, right? But you didn't make that mistake again. And, but you're right. And I think too, things have changed. Gosh, I'm starting to sound like my dad, but to me, it was better back in the 90s. And I'm only going to relate back to when I was starting with the Indians in 1990. You didn't have cell phones. You didn't have social media. And so guys were not as on guard as they are now. Guys are burned constantly. I can remember you'd be on the road and, you might go down to the bar after a ball game and have a couple of beers with 4 or 5 players and maybe a coach. You can't do that anymore. And the reason being is you're not doing anything wrong, but somebody's going to have a cell phone in there, and they can turn that photo op online and make it look 180 degrees different than what it was. And so you understand why players get a little guarded and a little bit concerned about, what is the agenda here?
You talk about the glory days of the 90s. Let's talk about the glory days of like the 30s and the 40s and 50s. Bob Feller. You got to know Bob really well.
Yeah.
I met him when I was in 8th grade. I've read a couple books. And Scott, did you ever meet Bob Feller, by the way?
I don't know if I did or not. I can't remember. I don't think I did because I might have been at school at the time when you met him.
So, Tom, he's an American hero, one of the best pitchers of all time.
Yep.
Loved the Indians. I mean, you hear stories about Bob, and I remember hearing an interview with you talking about how in 94's opening day of Jacobs Field, there's Bob getting real nervous that Randy Johnson's going to break his record or join him as the only pitchers in baseball to throw into a hitter on opening day. And you see him just getting really anxious because he didn't want it to be broken. He wanted to be the only guy. And then you hear stories about him being in his 80s, still pitching at fantasy camps down in Winter Haven, Florida. Can you tell us a hilarious Bob Feller story or something that we haven't heard of in interviews or read in the books just about him and what he meant to the organization and to the city?
Well, I wish I could tell you one, but I need to keep working. But
right.
I'll give you a hint.
Friendly story, that is. Podcast.
I wanted to put him on the air first time that we were going to face Ichiro Suzuki. Remember in 01, he was Rookie of the Year, American League Most Valuable Player, and Seattle was coming to town for the first time. And I saw Bob in the hallway and thought it'd be really unique because we had not seen anybody falling backwards out of the box, roping base hits, and thought it'd be neat to get him on the air on how he would pitch Ichiro. And what he told me in the hallway made me realize that I'd be parking cars if I put him on the air. And
yes,
there was, and again, same kind of a story happened when I talked to Jack Buck about something else, that those guys served in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
They were on the combat lines. There were things that weren't going to change in their mind. And I was like, okay. And you understood that. And you didn't take it the wrong way because you'd never been in their shoes.
Right.
And so, yeah, I came that close to losing my job had I put Bob on the air that night. But one of the funniest things for me was, and the beauty of Bob was he wasn't bitter Bob. You never heard him say, oh, this guy, I can't imagine what he's making, what I'd make now, blah, blah, blah. You never heard that from Bob. He loved those Indians teams whenever it was. He got us excited with postseason and whatnot as if he were still playing. A lot of ex-players aren't that way. They want to talk about, oh, it was better in my day and blah, blah, blah. That was never Bob. So we win the American League pennant in Seattle, Game 6 against Randy Johnson at the Kingdome in 95. That was the game that basically, in my mind, it ended when Kenny Lofton scored from second on a pass ball. Mm-hmm. Bob is down in the front row and, he's in a sport coat like he always was. And I mean, we win the game to win the pennant and he wants to celebrate with the guys and everything. And he leaps over the wall and he's out on the field. And the next thing you know, a cop has got him face down in the artificial surface, thinking he's some rowdy fan. And Bob's got his arm up, showing his ring finger going, 63 Hall of Fame. And like the cop is supposed to know that he's trying to show him his Hall of Fame ring.
Oh, no.
So that the cop knows who he is. Oh. And Bob DiBiasio ran over there and they got it all squared away. They got Bob off the carpet, I mean, these cops weren't fooling around. And then, Bob and the cops all, were laughed about it, but Bob signed some balls for them and everything else. But it was like, we've won the pennant and Bob Feller is face down in the Kingdome AstroTurf with a police officer and his back or his arm bent backwards. It was like, and then next thing you know, Bob's in our locker room celebrating like he was still playing. And I just thought that spoke volumes of Bob Feller not going, oh gosh, he wasn't bitter about it. In fact, he was just as excited about it as if he were still playing. And I don't know how many first pitches, I think it was Bert Blyleven that said, the next time Bob Feller throws out a first pitch, he will have pitched a complete game with all the first pitches that he has thrown. So he was loved by everybody. And boy, don't ask Bob a question right. If you didn't want the answer.
Yes, that's very, very true.
I always wondered, I said to Bobby D, do you have something somewhere, in the archives, it starts out the Cleveland Indians would like to apologize, to the following, because Bob could offend you, but the beauty of that is we don't have enough people that when you ask them a question, give you a straight answer. Bob didn't have an agenda.
No, no, he did not. Over the last, coming back to the last decade, 15 years, baseball's changed a lot. I mean, remember the 1990s, we'll call it the steroid era, call it whatever you want. Big increase in offense, lots of home runs, offense across the board. But now in this generation, you got home runs up, but strikeouts are up. Ball isn't put in play nearly as much, although in the last couple of years that seems to be changing. And you mentioned you don't want to sound like the old man, because sometimes I get on this soapbox too. Is it different? Is it harder? Do you enjoy, I don't know how to phrase this without being too subjective. Has it been hard for you to make that transition to this type of baseball compared to what it was 25 years ago?
Yeah. I don't know if it's been hard, because you love the game. And I think no matter how we try to screw up the game is always going to survive, because it has down through the years. I'm anxious to see what some of these changes are going to do this year. Look, I know analytics is here to stay. It's part of every sport, not just baseball. But, Danny O'Dowd once told me, he said the one problem he has with analytics is, and he used them as a general manager, is that what analytics have done has found a way to curtail offense, and we haven't found a way with analytics to improve offense. It's been all about preventing runs, whether it's how you pitch guys, how you now go with four-seam fastballs up and then work the bottom of the zone with breaking balls, how you only have a guy face a lineup once or twice through, where you shift, all of this. That's why I'm excited for this year that, you're going to have four infielders, two on each side of the bag, even though that shift is still kind of in play with that guy, obviously very close to second. What I miss is, and I don't think people ever talk enough about this, we saw arguably the greatest keystone combination in the history of the game in Omar and Robbie Alomar.
Mm-hmm.
Those guys would be neutered in today's game. You don't have to be a good second baseman and have range, because you only have to move 5 feet to each side when you're in a shift. All those plays Omar made up the middle. I watched it again the other night because I wanted to make sure I remembered it correctly. But Omar Vizquel makes a backhanded diving stop in the outfield that saves Game 6 of the World Series against Miami. That doesn't get talked about because we lost Game 7. But if that base hit by Charles Johnson got through, instead of it being the inning-ending out and 2 runs not scoring, we don't win Game 6. But those kind of plays you don't see in today's game that much because of the shift. They don't have as much ground to cover. So I'm hoping the changes that are being implemented bring back having range, being good defensively, not because of where you're stationed, but because of your athleticism. And, I know people say, well, hit the ball the other way. Well, the guys that keep saying hit the ball the other way never were facing 98 miles an hour with the ball moving the way it moves. Mm-hmm. So hopefully the pitch clock, the hitter standing in the batter's box, guys, I'm not concerned about length or time of game. I'm concerned about pace of play. John Miller once said, there are 3.5-hour games that weren't long enough. There are 2.5-hour games that were too long. And so it's all about the game action itself. And I hope we get away. I hope last year's Guardians team starts a trend where it wasn't all or nothing. Now, at the end of the day, it hurt us in the playoffs because we didn't score unless we hit home runs, and we're not a home run hitting team. But I think we need to get back to not necessarily the way the game was played 40 years ago, but I don't think any of us wants this to be a 3-pitch outcome. Home run, walk, or a strikeout. That's not what, brought us to the ballpark and made, like, think of our lineup in the mid-90s. Kenny Lofton, one of the greatest leadoff hitters in the history of the game, and how he impacted the game with his glove, with his legs, and everything. And then Omar Vizquel was the same way. Then you had power guys, but Baerga was still hitting 300 and driving the ball with power, and you can go on down the line. But what made those teams so good is they did everything. Caught the ball, they hit for average, and they hit for power, and that's what we need again. I think watching the Yankees is about as boring as it gets, because if they don't hit a home run, they don't score. They didn't against us, and they obviously couldn't against Houston.
So, Tom, one question about we'll call it the good old days, and then we're going to kind of work forward to the current Guardians. The clubhouse has certainly changed over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 70s, 80s, even before then, you had guys that were, drinking beer all the time and all that sort of thing. How has it changed since you started in the 80s and 90s to what it is today? And I know there's some things maybe you can't talk about that you've seen maybe in the clubhouse, but I mean, how has it changed?
Biggest thing that I see on the road, now for fans out there, everything's changed a little bit because of COVID, but let's say the general rule of thumb was you would have a bus 30 minutes after the game, 45 minutes after the game, hour after the game. Usually the only people on the first bus back to the hotel 30 minutes after a game were a few coaches, maybe the broadcasters, a couple of players. The first bus now is packed. Players don't stay in the clubhouse after the game. They're boom, they're out of there and they're back to the hotel. Now they may be going out with players or whatnot, but when you talk to guys that played the game, the Rick Mannings, and it wasn't that long ago, they hung around and had a couple of beers and they talked about the game. And, I think, bonds were created that way. Now, what I will say about our club, and I was just down to the facility yesterday and ran into Josh Naylor. Now, I'm going in a different direction, but okay. There are almost 100 players in camp as of February 1st, 21 players from the 40-man roster already in camp, 2 weeks before spring training. And Josh was saying, man, we're having a ball. You should see all the chess tables, guys playing each other, different guys playing every day. Our guys have really developed a bond and a chemistry, and that was part of why they did what they did a year ago. But, you don't see guys hang around as much. Now, part of it could also, in fairness, be when we used to go to the ballpark, the players were on the bus with. They're at the ballpark now by 1 o'clock for a night game. So they're already there way longer, probably 4 hours before it used to be that way. So they get to the park earlier because they're doing a lot of extra work, and whether it's with strength and conditioning or hitting or whatever it might be. And then they're also out of the park earlier. So at the end of the day, it probably balances itself, but it's really different in that regard. But I think the biggest thing too is, guys are much more conscious of their health. Hell, we have people on the plane that are telling you when to go to sleep. And, so they've taken nutrition and all of that, anything to try to get an edge. So that's one of the biggest differences for me. And the other thing is you just don't see players down at, and I don't want people to think, well, you don't want them boozing all night, but I'm just saying you used to be able to go to the hotel bar and it would really be fun. You could see a lot of people be down there maybe an hour after a game, have a couple of beers, go to bed. But again, our society has changed all of that with the cell phone, with social media. A lot of these guys they're like your teenagers. They go up and they get a big room that they're all in and they're playing games, So I didn't see Albert Bell doing that back in the 90s. Might have broken the game, but, it's just, different time. And we're also talking 30 years.
Sure. More on Albert Bell in a moment, and before we get into the current team, because I do have Albert Bell question for you coming up. But before we do get into the current Guardians, let's still talk a little bit about the past real quick. You've been on the mic for so many great games, Tom, in the 90s, mid 2000s, 2016, 17, 18 playoffs, and then this past year. Do you have a favorite call that stands out in your mind? Do you ever go back and listen to them?
No, I don't, because you're always disappointed when you do it, because you listen to it and you go, I could have done this better, and I could have done that, or I should have done this. So I don't like to do that. But I mean, to me, the greatest moment in the ballpark's history is Rajay Davis's at bat, much less the home run against Aroldis Chapman in Game 7 of the 2016 World Series. I mean, that thing just built and built and built. I believe, I'd have to go back and look, I think he had 5 two-strike foul balls. I mean, so it was just like the tension just kept ratcheting up, and he kept choking up a little bit more on the bat with each fastball from Chapman. And it was truly mano a mano. Chapman was going to throw his best fastball, and Rajay, that was all he had to look for. And, you know, for that ballpark to be transported into Disney World like it was at that moment is something I'll take to my grave. I think it's the greatest moment in the history of that park.
Now the pitch. Swung on, line to deep left field. It is gone! Rajay Davis!
It gets lost in it, but Jason Giambi had a game-winning walk-off home run. Tito's first year, 2013. I mean, first off, all of us were like, he's coming to Cleveland? He could get any job. He's won 2 World Series. How are we getting him? And we have been terrible for 3 consecutive years. And you didn't look at Tito coming and go, well, we'll be a playoff team now. You were like, huh? Okay. And the next thing you know, they win 10 in a row down the stretch to clinch the wild card. And Giambi, we lost the lead. Chris Perez gave up a home run, and the White Sox in the 10th inning took the lead by a run and or 2 runs, whatever it was. And Jason Giambi hits either a 2 or 3 run home run to walk it off in September of 2013. Now, we haven't been to the playoffs since 2007. And if we don't win that game, we don't go to the playoffs that year.
The 1-1 pitch. A swing and a drive to deep right. Away back. Gone! Jason Giambi has done it for the second time off the White Sox.
I guess you look back at it now, and that was the beginning of the Tito era, where, oh, okay, every year we're going to be relevant now with this guy. I thought that was one of the biggest home runs in a game that maybe a lot of people have forgotten about. I mean, we just had so many great moments that it's hard to pick them all down. Sandy Alomar, you know, in Game 4 in the 97, I thought it was the best postseason we'll ever see. Beat the Yankees in 5 intense games in 97. They were the defending champs. Sandy hits that homer in the 8th inning to tie the game off Mariano Rivera, who then went something like 13 years before he ever gave up another postseason homer. Also that October, we beat Baltimore in the ALCS. We all remember Tony Fernandez winning it in extra innings to win the pennant, but we had a game in Cleveland where Marquise Grissom missed either Marquise missed it or Omar missed it. And one was at third and one was at the plate, missed suicide squeeze, and we won the game.
Oh, yeah.
And because the ball bounced away from the Baltimore catcher, Webster. So, and that's just, I mean, 95 was just every night. It was magical. They had 27 last at bat wins out of 100. Down 7-0 to David Cohn, and Paul Sorrento walks it off. I just, you know, you probably should sit down and go over it sometime. But you know, I thought going back to 2016, I mean, what Ryan Merritt did in, a game that he had no business even pitching in, and kept them at bay, and you win the pennant. That World Series obviously was so memorable against the Cubs. I thought in 2007 we should have won the pennant, would have won the World Series that year.
Mm-hmm.
But, as far as memories, I mean, Tony Pena, walk-off home run that maybe 95 changes. That's game one of the playoffs against Boston.
Yep.
And you walk it off in extra innings after Albert Bell earlier in the game had tied the game with a home run. So, yeah, it's hard to really pinpoint. You start going through so many.
Hope you enjoyed part one with Tom Hamilton. Coming up, we're going to talk about the 90s heydays. If you were around for that, he's got a lot of great stories. And we're also going to talk about the current Guardians and what we can expect heading into the 2023 season.
Yeah, part two should be just as exciting as part one. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing. If you haven't already, do so on Apple, on Spotify. Follow the pod at Sable Brothers on Twitter. You can follow yours truly at John_Sable.
And you can follow me at Scott Sable, FOX8.
Thanks for tuning in for part one of our conversation with Guardians broadcaster Tom Hamilton. We'll see you guys next week for part two right here on the Press Play Podcast Network.